Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. On the surface, the Crosswinds Hotel looked like any other mid-tier establishment catering to weary travelers. Nestled off a quiet stretch of highway, it offered the basics: clean rooms, free breakfast, and polite but unremarkable staff. However, tucked away on the sixth floor was room 609, a room most employees knew better than to discuss, and most guests stumbled upon purely by chance. It wasn't that room 609 had a reputation for being haunted or cursed. It was stranger than that. Guests who stayed there would always report the same phenomenon: vivid, surreal dreams that felt more real than reality. The hotel management ignored the rumors, chalking it up to overactive imaginations or overly tired guests. But for those who spent a night in room 609, their dreams would leave marks, both on their minds and sometimes their lives. The night Jackson Cole checked into the Crosswinds Hotel, he was just looking for a place to sleep. A traveling salesman with a long stretch of road behind him, Jackson wasn't picky. "Any room available?" he asked the front desk clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. She hesitated, glancing at the computer screen. "We're pretty full tonight." Her voice trailed off as she scrolled through the available rooms. Then with a faint grimace, she said, "Looks like I've got room 609 open. Will that be okay?" "Sure," Jackson said, sliding his credit card across the counter. As he walked away, the clerk whispered to herself, "Good luck." Jackson dropped his suitcase by the door of room 609 and collapsed onto the bed. The room was ordinary: tan walls, beige carpet, a desk with a lamp that flickered slightly. He was asleep within minutes. That night he dreamed of a garden bathed in moonlight, every leaf glistening as if coated in silver. A voice, soft, almost melodic, whispered his name from somewhere in the shadows. "Jackson." He turned, trying to find the source of the voice. As he walked deeper into the garden, the moonlight dimmed and the air grew cold. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. The voice didn't answer, but a figure appeared. A woman in a flowing white dress, her face obscured. She reached out to him, her fingers brushing his hand. He woke up with a jolt, his heart pounding. His hand tingled where she had touched him. "Just a dream," he muttered, shaking his head. But the image of the woman lingered. Jackson planned to leave the next morning, but a storm had rolled in overnight, making the roads dangerous. He decided to stay another night. That evening, as he passed the front desk, he asked the clerk, "Ever have weird dreams staying here?" The clerk froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "What do you mean?" "Last night, I dreamed of a garden. It was intense." She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "You're in 609, aren't you?" "Yeah, why?" She hesitated, as if deciding whether to tell him the truth. "People who stay in that room, they all have strange dreams. Some say the room shows you things you're meant to see." "What kind of things?" She shrugged. "Depends on the person." That night, Jackson dreamed again. This time, he was in a city, a sprawling metropolis that pulsed with unnatural energy. The streets were filled with people wearing masks, their expressions hidden. He wandered through the crowd, feeling out of place. A man in a dark coat approached him, holding a silver key. "The answers you seek lie behind the door," the man said, handing him the key. "What door?" Jackson asked. But the man disappeared. The dream shifted. Jackson was back in the moonlit garden, and the woman in white was waiting for him. This time, her face was partially visible: sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes. She reached for him again, but he hesitated. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm someone who knows you better than you know yourself." she said cryptically. Don't ignore the key. He woke up clutching something cold in his hand. He opened his palm, and there it was, the silver key from his dream. The discovery of the key sent Jackson spiraling. He spent hours searching the room, convinced it hid some secret door or compartment, but there was nothing. Frustrated, he went to the front desk. The clerk's face turned pale when he showed her the key. That's impossible, she said. Why? What does it mean? She bit her lip. I've only heard rumors, but some say room 609 is alive in a way. It shows people things they need to confront, memories, regrets, fears. Sometimes it helps them. Sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't make any sense, Jackson said. But deep down, he felt the truth in her words. On his third night in room 609, Jackson prepared himself for whatever the room had in store. He fell asleep clutching the key, his mind racing. This time the dream began in a familiar place, his childhood home. He walked through the empty rooms, hearing faint echoes of laughter and voices from the past. In the living room, he saw his younger self sitting on the floor, building a house of cards. Do you remember why you stopped dreaming? The woman's voice asked. Jackson turned to see her standing behind him, fully visible now. Her face was striking but strange, as if it didn't belong to this world. I don't know, he admitted. The scene shifted. He was in his office, staring at a desk piled with contracts and sales reports. The weight of his adult life bore down on him, suffocating. You forgot what mattered, the woman said. What am I supposed to do? He asked desperately. She handed him the key again. Find the door. When Jackson woke, he knew he couldn't stay in the hotel any longer. The dreams had shaken something loose inside him. A realization that his life had become empty and routine. He packed his bags and checked out, determined to leave room 609 behind. But as he walked out to his car, he noticed something strange. The silver key was still in his pocket. He turned back to look at the hotel, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the woman in white watching him from the window of room 609. He never returned to the Crosswinds Hotel, but the dreams didn't stop. Night after night, he found himself wandering the moonlit garden, the masked city, the hallways of his past, and always the silver key remained in his possession, waiting for him to find the door it opened. Nestled at the edge of a sleepy village lay a sprawling estate known as Briarwood Manor. The centerpiece of the manor was not its grand, ivy-clad mansion, but the lush garden that stretched across several acres behind it. This garden was famed for its beauty, a kaleidoscope of vibrant flowers, elegant fountains, and winding cobblestone paths. But what drew visitors and artists alike from far and wide were the statues. They were exquisite, carved with a skill so precise that they seemed almost alive. Marble nymphs danced among rose bushes, stone knights stood in solemn vigil near a reflecting pool, and a pair of griffins flanked the entrance to the hedge maze. Each statue bore an expression so vivid it felt as though their eyes followed you as you wandered through the garden. The villagers spoke of the garden in hushed tones, sharing whispers over mugs of ale at the local tavern. They told stories of strange noises coming from the estate at night. The faint clink of stone against stone, the rustle of bushes when no wind blew, and even the sound of laughter echoing through the garden long after the sun had set. No one dared to enter the garden after dark, save for the caretaker, an elderly man named Cedric. He had tended the garden for decades, pruning the hedges, polishing the statues, and ensuring the estate's beauty remained untouched by time. Cedric was a quiet man who never spoke of the garden's secrets, though many suspected he knew far more than he let on. One summer evening, a curious soul arrived in the village. Her name was Eleanor, a young artist searching for inspiration for her next masterpiece. She had heard tales of Briarwood Garden and its hauntingly lifelike statues, and her curiosity burned brighter than her fear of local legends. Eleanor rented a small room in the village and spent her days sketching the statues, captivated by their beauty and mystery. She was particularly drawn to a statue of a young woman standing beneath a willow tree, her face turned skyward as if basking in the moonlight. The plaque at the base read, Lysandra. Who was she? Eleanor asked Cedric one day as he passed by with his pruning shears. She was said to be the lord of the manor's daughter, Cedric replied, his voice gruff but tinged with sadness. She died young, and the statue was made in her memory. Eleanor could sense there was more to the story, but Cedric offered no further details, and she didn't press him. As the days passed, Eleanor became increasingly enchanted by the garden. She stayed later each evening, determined to capture every detail in her sketches. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the garden was bathed in the silvery light of a full moon, Eleanor decided to stay after dark. She had brought a lantern and her sketchbook, settling herself near the statue of Lysandra. The garden was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets. But as the moon rose higher, Eleanor began to notice strange things. The air grew heavy, charged with an inexplicable energy. The shadows cast by the statues seemed to shift, as though they were no longer bound by the moon's light. A soft rustling reached her ears, and she turned to see the willow tree's branches swaying, though there was no breeze. And then she saw it. Lysandra's statue moved. It was subtle at first, a slight tilt of the head, the soft flutter of marble fingers. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched the stone lips curve into a faint smile. Before her eyes, Lysandra stepped down from her pedestal, her movements fluid and graceful. Eleanor wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. Instead, she watched in stunned silence as other statues began to stir. The knights unsheathed their swords, the nymphs twirled among the flowers, and the griffins stretched their wings as if shaking off centuries of stillness. The garden had come alive. Lysandra turned to Eleanor, her eyes no longer cold marble but warm and alive, meeting the artist's gaze. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice like the rustling of leaves. I didn't mean to intrude," Eleanor stammered, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. "You've seen us now," Lysandra said, her expression unreadable. "Few have, and fewer still have lived to tell of it." Before Eleanor could respond, a deep voice rumbled through the garden. "She's no threat, Lysandra." Eleanor turned to see Cedric stepping into the clearing, his lantern casting long shadows across the cobblestones. He didn't seem the least bit surprised to find the statues alive. "She's just an artist," Cedric said, his eyes softening as they met Lysandra's. "Let her be." Lysandra hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but you must leave before dawn," she said to Eleanor, "and you must never speak of what you've seen." Eleanor nodded fervently, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, as she packed her things and hurried back to the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something extraordinary. She wanted to tell the world, but she knew the truth would be met with disbelief, and perhaps worse. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's art blossomed in ways she had never imagined. Her sketches of the garden and its statues captivated audiences far and wide, though she kept the secret of their nightly dance locked away in her heart. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the world was still, she often wondered if the statues remembered her as she remembered them, a fleeting connection between worlds, alive only under the light of the moon. The Orb of Echoes. The glass orb sat in the corner of an old dusty shop in the heart of the city, its surface shimmering faintly with an inner light. The shop itself, curiosities and oddities, was the kind of place most people walked past without a second glance. It was small and cramped, with shelves crowded by strange artifacts, clockwork birds that never chirped, mirrors that reflected things that weren't there, and books that wrote themselves as you turned the pages. Behind the counter sat an elderly shopkeeper named Malachi, whose piercing gray eyes seemed to see straight into a person's soul. He never advertised his wares, nor did he beckon customers inside. Those who needed to find the shop always found it. On a cold, rainy evening, a young woman named Clara stumbled into the store. She was soaked to the bone, her umbrella having surrendered to the fierce wind outside. Her cheeks were flushed with frustration as she scanned the peculiar shelves. Clara hadn't planned to stop here, but something about the warm, golden light spilling through the shop's window had drawn her in. Malachi greeted her with a knowing smile. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. Clara hesitated. She had no idea what she was looking for. All she knew was that her life had been falling apart lately. Her job was a dead end, her relationship strained, and every step forward seemed to drag her 2 steps back. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something meaningful, I guess." Malachi nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Without another word, he gestured for her to follow him. He led her to a small table tucked into the far corner of the shop. Atop the table sat the glass orb, its surface smooth and flawless. "This," Malachi said, "is the Orb of Echoes. It shows glimpses of the future." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "The future?" "Not the whole story," Malachi clarified. "Just fragments, glimpses, moments. It doesn't tell you what to do, nor does it reveal everything, but it can be illuminating." Clara stared at the orb. Its surface seemed to ripple, like a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. She felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if it were calling to her. "What's the catch?" she asked warily. Malachi smiled faintly. "The future is not set in stone. What you see may change, depending on the choices you make, and sometimes knowing what's to come can be more of a burden than a gift." Despite his warning, Clara couldn't resist. "How much?" Malachi named a modest price, far less than she'd expected for something so extraordinary. She handed over the money and he carefully placed the orb in a wooden box lined with velvet. "Remember," he said as she left the shop, "the future is a fragile thing." That night, Clara sat in her small apartment, the orb resting on her coffee table. The rain continued to patter against the windows as she hesitated, unsure if she truly wanted to look. Finally, she placed her hands on the orb. At first, nothing happened, but then the surface of the glass shimmered, and an image appeared. She saw herself standing on a stage, her face lit with joy as an audience erupted into applause. The scene shifted, and she was sitting in a sunlit cafe, laughing with a man whose face she didn't recognize. Another image followed, a dark alley, her footsteps quickening as a shadow loomed behind her. Clara pulled her hands away, her heart pounding. The images had been so vivid, so real. She couldn't make sense of them. Were they warnings, promises, or mere possibilities? Over the next few weeks, Clara found herself haunted by the glimpses she'd seen. The image of herself on stage filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She had always dreamed of becoming a playwright, but she'd abandoned that dream long ago. The orb's vision reignited her passion, and she began writing again, pouring her heart into her work. The cafe scene intrigued her as well. Who was the man? Was he a stranger, a friend, or something more? She started visiting cafes she'd never been to, her eyes scanning the faces of every patron. But the dark alley plagued her most of all. She found herself avoiding certain streets and looking over her shoulder constantly. The fear of that moment hung over her like a storm cloud, making her question every decision. One evening, as she walked home from work, Clara found herself at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. She could take her usual route, a well-lit street filled with shops and people, or she could take a shortcut through a quiet alley. She froze, remembering the vision, the shadow, the looming danger. Her instincts screamed at her to stick to the main road. But then she thought of Malachi's words. The future is not set in stone. Gritting her teeth, she chose the alley. Her footsteps echoed against the walls, the faint hum of the city distant and muted. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest, and then she heard it, a second set of footsteps. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Clara? It was the man from the cafe vision. As it turned out, the man, Daniel, had been following her to return a notebook she'd accidentally left behind at work earlier that day. They ended up talking for hours that night, first in the alley and then at a nearby diner. Over time, Daniel became a constant presence in Clara's life. He encouraged her to submit her play to a local theater company, and to her astonishment, it was accepted. The night of the premiere, as she stood on stage to take her bow, she realized she was living the vision she'd seen in the orb. Years later, Clara returned to curiosities and oddities. She found Malachi in his usual spot behind the counter. "I thought I'd thank you," she said, holding the orb. "It changed my life." Malachi smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Are you sure it wasn't you who changed your life?" Clara considered this. Perhaps the orb had merely shown her what was possible, and the rest had been up to her. She placed the orb back on the table. "Maybe someone else needs it now." Malachi nodded, and as Clara left the shop, she couldn't help but feel that the orb would continue its mysterious work, helping those who needed it most, one glimpse at a time. The Ballad of the Forgotten. In the quiet, mist-shrouded town of Ashbourne, there was a melody that no one dared to play. It was whispered about in the corners of the local inn, mentioned only in hushed voices during stormy nights. The song was known as the Ballad of the Forgotten, a haunting piece said to summon the spirits of those long gone. The legend went back centuries, to a time when Ashbourne was nothing more than a small settlement surrounded by dense woods. A traveling minstrel had arrived, carrying a lute made of dark, polished wood and strings that shimmered like moonlight. He claimed to have composed a song that could awaken the dead, not as vengeful specters, but as shadows of who they once were, yearning to remember their lives. Some said the minstrel was cursed, doomed to wander the earth playing his forbidden tune. Others believed he had stumbled upon ancient magic too powerful to contain. Whatever the truth, the minstrel disappeared one night, leaving behind only his song. Generations passed, and the ballad became a tale to frighten children or entertain tourists. No one truly believed it until Emma arrived in Ashbourne. Emma was a music student from the city, her life filled with the hum of orchestra and the chatter of bustling streets. She had come to Ashbourne for solitude, hoping the quiet town would inspire her next composition. She rented a small cottage on the edge of the woods, its windows overlooking the sprawling cemetery that had been there since the town's founding. She first heard about the Ballad of the Forgotten from Mr. Harper, the elderly innkeeper who served her tea on rainy afternoons. His wrinkled hands shook as he spoke of the song, his voice low and trembling. "Don't play it if you come across it," he warned, his eyes clouded with something between fear and reverence. "Music is powerful, and that song, it stirs things best left undisturbed." Emma smiled politely but dismissed the story as superstition. She had always been drawn to folklore and ghost stories, but she didn't believe in such things. Still, the idea intrigued her. One evening, as she explored the attic of her cottage, she found an old weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and its pages smelled of dust and time. Inside, she discovered a collection of sheet music, the ink faded but still legible. Among the pages was a piece titled "The Ballad of the Forgotten." Emma's heart quickened as she studied the notes. The melody was complex, filled with eerie crescendos and haunting minor chords. She felt a strange pull toward the music, as if it were calling to her. Ignoring Mr. Harper's warning, she sat at her piano and began to play. The first notes drifted through the air like a sigh, soft and melancholy. As Emma's fingers moved across the keys, the room seemed to grow colder. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight deepened, stretching across the walls like grasping hands. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet she thought she'd imagined it. "Emma?" She froze, her fingers hovering above the keys. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the room. Turning slowly, she saw them. Figures were materializing in the dim light, translucent and shimmering like heat waves. Their faces were pale and blurred, their eyes hollow and searching. They filled the room, their forms overlapping as though they didn't quite belong in the physical world. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but something kept her rooted in place. The ghosts didn't move toward her. Instead, they seemed to focus on the music. "Play!" one of them rasped, its voice echoing like the rustle of dead leaves. With trembling hands, Emma resumed the melody. The ghosts swayed with the notes, their forms growing more defined with every chord. She saw a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her veil trailing like mist. A soldier in a ragged uniform, his hand resting on the hilt of a spectral sword. A child clutching a stuffed bear, her face streaked with tears that shimmered like moonlight. Each ghost carried the weight of forgotten lives. Emma could feel their sorrow, their longing to be remembered. The music wasn't just a song, it was a bridge between worlds, pulling the past into the present. As the final note faded, the ghost turned to Emma. "Thank you," the bride whispered, her voice soft and filled with gratitude. "You've given us a moment we thought lost forever." Before Emma could respond, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into wisps of light. The room grew silent, the only sound the faint creak of the piano bench as Emma leaned back, her heart pounding. In the days that followed, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the ghosts. Who were they? What stories had they left untold? Driven by curiosity, she began researching Ashbourne's history, poring over old records and speaking to anyone who would listen. She learned that the bride had been Eleanor Whitfield, a young woman who died on her wedding day when her carriage overturned on a muddy road. The soldier was Thomas Grayson, a war hero who had returned home only to succumb to an illness that swept through the town. The child, Lily, had perished in a fire that destroyed her family's home. Emma felt a deep connection to these forgotten souls. She began composing a new piece, one that told their stories through music. She called it The Symphony of Shadows, and it became her life's work. But she never played the Ballad of the Forgotten again, until the night the townspeople came to her door. It was a stormy evening when they arrived, their faces pale and anxious. Something was wrong, they told her. The cemetery had been disturbed, graves opened, headstones toppled. Strange lights had been seen in the woods, and whispers filled the air at night. They begged Emma to play the ballad, believing it might calm whatever unrest had taken hold. Reluctantly, she agreed. That night, as the townspeople gathered in the church, Emma sat at the ancient organ and began to play. The ghosts appeared once more, their forms filling the pews like an ethereal congregation. But this time, they were joined by others, dozens, hundreds, their faces etched with sorrow and hope. As Emma played, the spirits listened, their murmurs growing softer until they were no more than a hum. When the final note faded, the ghosts bowed their heads and vanished, leaving the church in silence. The town was never the same after that night. The disturbances ceased, and the cemetery returned to its peaceful state. Emma became a legend in Ashbourne, her music celebrated for bringing peace to the restless dead. But she knew the truth. The ballad wasn't just a song, it was a gift and a curse. It reminded the living of the forgotten, bridging the gap between the worlds for a fleeting moment. And though Emma promised herself she would never play it again, the sheet music remained on her piano, waiting for the day it might be needed once more. The Lantern of Lost Paths. On the outskirts of the bustling city of Greyhaven, There stood a forgotten shop at the end of a crooked alley. The shop was small and unassuming, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. The faded words read, "Wayfinder's Curios." Few people ventured there, but those who did always left with something strange and extraordinary. For years, the shopkeeper, an enigmatic figure named Elias, quietly tended to his wares. He was a man of indeterminate age, with silver-streaked hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to know more than they should. He claimed to sell objects that helped people find what they truly sought, though his customers often left with more questions than answers. One rainy evening, a young woman named Alina stumbled into the shop. She was a traveler, her boots caked with mud and her cloak damp from the relentless downpour. Her face bore the weariness of someone who had been wandering for too long without a destination. "Looking for something?" Elias asked, his voice soft but resonant. Alina hesitated. She didn't know why she had come in. The truth was, she had been wandering for months, ever since she had lost her parents and her home to a fire that had consumed everything. She had no family left, no direction, and no purpose. I don't know where to go," she admitted. "I feel lost." Elias studied her for a long moment before disappearing into the back of the shop. When he returned, he carried an object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the counter and slowly unwrapped it, revealing an old lantern. The lantern was unlike any Alina had ever seen. Its metal frame was intricate, carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift when the light caught them. The glass panels glowed faintly, though no flame burned inside. "This is the lantern of lost paths," Elias said. "It lights the way to what you need most, even if you don't yet know what that is." Alina frowned. "What does that mean?" Elias smiled, enigmatic as ever. "The paths it reveals are invisible to the ordinary eye. It will show you roads and trails that others cannot see, paths that lead to answers, to truths, and sometimes to dangers." She reached out to touch the lantern, and the faint glow grew brighter under her fingertips. "How does it work?" "You'll know when you light it," Elias said. "But be warned, the paths it shows are not always easy to walk. They may take you through darkness before leading you to the light." Alina felt a strange pull toward the lantern, as though it was calling to her. "How much?" Elias waved a hand. "Payment is not required now. One day, when the time is right, you'll repay me in your own way." She hesitated, but eventually nodded. She took the lantern and left the shop, the rain easing as she stepped back into the alley. That night, as she set up camp in the woods outside the city, Alina couldn't resist the urge to light the lantern. She struck a match and touched it to the empty space where a wick should have been. To her surprise, the lantern flared to life, its glow warm and golden. As the light spread, something incredible happened. A path appeared before her, winding through the trees. It wasn't the dirt road she had been following, but something entirely new. A trail of soft, shimmering light that seemed to pulse with life. Alina's heart raced. She knew the lantern was showing her the way, but to what? Taking a deep breath, she shouldered her pack and began to follow the glowing path. The trail led her through forests she didn't recognize, past ancient ruins covered in moss and ivy. Along the way, she began to notice strange things. She heard whispers in the wind, fragments of voices she couldn't quite understand. She saw shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, as though someone or something was watching her. The first night, the path led her to a crumbling stone bridge spanning a rushing river. She hesitated, unsure if it was safe to cross. But as she held up the lantern, its light grew brighter, illuminating the way. She took a step onto the bridge, and then another until she had safely crossed. Each night, the lantern guided her to a place to rest, a sheltered cave, a cluster of trees that shielded her from the elements, a hollow in the earth where a spring bubbled with fresh water. It seemed to know what she needed, even when she didn't. As the days turned into weeks, Alina began to change. She grew stronger, more confident. The lantern's light revealed not only hidden paths, but also parts of herself she had forgotten. Her resilience, her courage, her ability to adapt. But not all the paths were easy. One night, the trail led her into a dark, mist-filled valley. The air was cold and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shapes moved in the fog, and Alina felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's there?" she called, holding the lantern high. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing figures emerging from the mist. They were people, ghostly, translucent, their faces filled with sorrow. Alina realized they were the spirits of those who had been lost, just like her. One of them stepped forward, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You carry the lantern," she said, her voice echoing softly. "You can guide us." "Guide you where?" Alina asked, her voice trembling. "To peace," the woman replied. Alina hesitated, then nodded. She didn't fully understand, but she knew she couldn't turn away. Holding the lantern steady, she led the spirits through the valley. The path was long and treacherous, but the lantern's light never faltered. When they reached the end, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light of the lantern. The woman turned to Alina one last time. "Thank you," she said. "You are not as lost as you think." When the final spirit vanished, the lantern's light dimmed. Exhausted but filled with a strange sense of purpose, Alina continued her journey. The paths the lantern showed her grew brighter, more defined. They led her to new towns, to people who needed help, to places where she could make a difference. She became a guide, a wayfinder for those who had lost their way, just as she once had. One day she returned to the shop where it had all begun. Elias was there, as though he had been waiting for her. "You've done well," he said, his green eyes twinkling. "I think I've found my path," Alina replied, placing the lantern on the counter. Elias smiled. "The lantern doesn't belong to any one person for long. It finds those who need it most. And now it will wait for the next lost soul." Alina left the shop, the weight of the lantern replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. She no longer needed the light to guide her. She had become her own beacon, and in the quiet corner of Wayfinder's Curios, the lantern of lost paths sat once more, waiting for the next traveler to find their way. Curse of Silent Whispers. The village of Haven's Reach sat on the edge of a vast and ancient forest. To outsiders, it was an idyllic place. Quaint cottages with thatched roofs, flower-filled gardens, and a river that wound through the town like a silver ribbon. But the villagers knew the truth. Haven's Reach was cursed. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been stories of people losing their voices. It always began the same way. A slight hoarseness, a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the whispers, faint and indistinct, as if carried on the wind. Finally, the victim would wake one morning to find their voice gone entirely, stolen as if it had never existed. No one could explain it. The curse seemed random, striking young and old, rich and poor. Those afflicted could not scream, cry, or even whisper. The silence was absolute. Some said the forest was to blame, that it harbored a vengeful spirit. Others whispered that it was the work of an old crone who had been wronged by the village centuries ago. The latest victim of the curse was a young girl named Lila. She was only 14, with a voice as sweet as birdsong. Lila loved to sing, and her songs had brought comfort to the villagers during dark times. But one morning, as she tried to hum a tune while fetching water from the well, her voice faltered. She coughed and rubbed her throat, thinking nothing of it. By the next day, her voice was barely a whisper. Her mother, worried, took her to the village healer, but the old woman only shook her head. "It's begun," she said grimly. By the third day, Lila's voice was gone completely. She sat by the fire, clutching her throat, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her mother tried to console her, but there was nothing she could do. That night, as Lila lay in bed, She heard them, the whispers. They floated through the room like a soft breeze, carrying words she couldn't quite make out. They seemed to beckon her, pulling her toward the window. Heart pounding, Lila crept out of bed and peered outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the village. Beyond the cottages, the forest loomed, its trees swaying gently as if alive. She saw a shadow moving at the edge of the woods, a figure shrouded in darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Without thinking, Lila grabbed her cloak and slipped outside. The air was cold, and the ground was damp beneath her bare feet as she approached the forest. The whispers guided her, leading her deeper into the trees. She should have been afraid, but she felt strangely calm, as if the whispers were reassuring her. After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. At its base sat an old woman. Her hair was white as snow, and her eyes gleamed like polished stones. "You've come," the woman said, her voice raspy but strong. Lila opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The woman chuckled softly. "Ah, yes, the curse. It always brings them to me eventually." Lila frowned, confused. She pointed to her throat, then to the woman, hoping she could explain. "The curse is mine," the woman said simply. "Long ago, this village wronged me. They took everything from me, my home, my family, my voice. In my grief, I called upon the forest, and it answered. It gave me power, but it came at a cost. I can never leave this place, and I can never speak above a whisper. But the curse ensures that the village will never forget me." Lila's heart ached for the woman, but she couldn't condone what had been done to her and the village. She knelt before the woman, silently pleading for her voice to be returned. The woman studied her for a long moment. "You're not like the others," she said finally. "Most come here demanding answers, or cursing my name. But you've come in peace." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "This is your voice," she said. "I can give it back to you, but it comes with a choice." Lila tilted her head, waiting. "You can take your voice and leave," the woman continued, "but the curse will remain, and others will continue to suffer. Or you can take the curse upon yourself, ending it for the village. You will never speak again, but no one else will lose their voice." Lila's eyes widened. She couldn't imagine a life without singing, without the joy of sharing her voice. But she also couldn't bear the thought of others enduring the same fate. After a moment, she pointed to herself, then to the vial, and shook her head. The woman's expression softened. "Brave child," she said. "Very well." She opened the vial and poured its contents onto the ground. A silvery mist rose, swirling around Lila before sinking into the earth. The whispers faded and the air grew still. "The curse is broken," the woman said. "The village is free. But you—" She reached out and touched Lila's cheek. "You have sacrificed much. I will give you something in return." The woman closed her eyes and began to hum. The sound was soft, but it resonated in the clearing, filling the air with warmth. Lila felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her very soul were vibrating. When the woman stopped, she smiled. "You may have lost your voice, but your song will never be forgotten." When Lila returned to the village, she found that the whispers were gone, and no one else had lost their voice. The villagers rejoiced, but they soon realized that Lila herself could no longer speak. In the years that followed, she became known as the Silent Guardian. Though she could not sing, her presence brought peace and comfort to those around her. The children of the village would often gather around her, feeling as though her silence told stories words never could. And though she never spoke again, the memory of her sacrifice lived on, whispered from generation to generation, ensuring that the curse would never be forgotten, even as its power faded into legend. The House of Whispering Walls. At the edge of a sprawling countryside in a small forgotten town called Fairhaven, stood an old, crumbling mansion that locals simply referred to as the Whispering House. It was a place cloaked in mystery, its windows dark and its gardens overtaken by vines and weeds. Generations of Fairhaven's residents shared eerie tales of the mansion, swearing that if you stepped inside, the walls would whisper to you secrets you were not meant to know. No one knew who built the house, nor why it seemed to repel all attempts at restoration. Most of the town avoided it entirely, save for the occasional daredevil teenager who would spend a night inside only to emerge pale, shaken, and forever unwilling to speak of what they heard. The mystery of the house lingered until one summer when a young woman named Eleanor arrived in Fairhaven. Eleanor was a historian by trade, traveling from town to town, documenting local legends and uncovering forgotten truths. She'd heard of the house in a passing conversation at a nearby inn and knew she couldn't resist its allure. Eleanor made her way to the house on a cloudless afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the cracked cobblestone path leading to the mansion's grand wooden doors. The house seemed to loom over her as she approached, its sagging roof and shattered windows giving it an air of resignation, as though it had been waiting for someone like her to come along. She pushed open the heavy door, which creaked loudly, echoing through the empty halls. Dust motes danced in the golden light streaming through gaps in the boarded-up windows. Inside, the house was a strange mix of decay and preservation. The furniture, though covered in thick layers of dust, was intact. Paintings hung crookedly on the walls, their subjects' faces obscured by years of grime. Eleanor pulled out her notebook and began to jot down observations. She had barely written a sentence when she heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as though it were coming from just behind her. "Stay. Listen." Eleanor spun around, but no one was there. Her heart raced, but her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She decided to stay, setting up her recording equipment in the main hall. As night fell, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. At first, Eleanor couldn't make out the words, but as she listened closely, she began to discern individual phrases. She lied about the child. He buried the money beneath the tree. The fire wasn't an accident. The whispers weren't just random sounds. They were secrets, intimate and scandalous. Some seemed mundane. A wife hiding an affair, a man stealing from his neighbor. Others were darker, betrayals, crimes, even confessions of murder. Eleanor couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as though the house held the memories of everyone who had ever lived there, and it was desperate to share them. She stayed up late into the night, transcribing every word she heard. The whispers grew more intense, filling the room until it felt as though the walls were alive, pulsing with energy. But then one whisper caught her attention, a voice that seemed to speak directly to her. "You're not safe here." The warning sent a chill down Eleanor's spine, but she refused to leave. She was determined to uncover the truth behind the house. Over the next few days, she scoured the mansion, uncovering old journals, photographs, and letters. The fragments of history painted a picture of a once prosperous family, the Harringtons, who had lived in the house more than a century ago. The patriarch, Arthur Harrington, had been a wealthy industrialist with a reputation for ruthlessness. Rumors of blackmail, fraud, and even murder surrounded him, though nothing was ever proven. His wife, Margaret, was said to be a recluse, rarely seen outside the house. Their only child, a boy named Victor, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. As Eleanor pieced together the family's history, the whispers seemed to guide her, growing louder whenever she was close to uncovering something important. In the library, she found a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside was a diary belonging to Margaret Harrington, The diary was filled with anguished entries about her husband's cruelty and her fear for Victor. In one passage, Margaret wrote of hearing whispers in the house, voices warning her of danger, urging her to leave, but she had ignored them, and tragedy had followed. The final entry read, "He knows. He knows I tried to take Victor away. The whispers tell me to hide, but I cannot escape. If anyone finds this, remember, the house knows the truth." That night, the whispers grew deafening, echoing through every room. They led Eleanor to the basement, a dark, cold space that smelled of damp earth. In the center of the room was a trap door, hidden beneath a rotting rug. As she opened it, a rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it a chorus of anguished voices. Eleanor descended the narrow staircase, her lantern casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. At the bottom, she found a small chamber, its walls covered in strange markings. In the center of the chamber was a shallow grave. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. The whispers surrounded her, louder than ever, and she could finally make out their words. "He killed us. He buried us here. Remember us." Eleanor dug into the earth with trembling hands, uncovering bones, first one skeleton, then another. There were at least 3 bodies buried there, their remains twisted and broken. One set of bones was smaller than the others, and Eleanor felt a wave of sorrow as she realized it must have been Victor. The whispers softened, as though they were relieved to have been heard. Eleanor contacted the authorities, and the bodies were exhumed. Forensic experts confirmed that the remains dated back to the time of the Harringtons. The discovery made headlines, and the story of Arthur Harrington's cruelty finally came to light. As the truth was revealed, the whispers in the house began to fade. Eleanor stayed one last night, and for the first time the mansion was silent. But before she left, she heard one final whisper, soft and filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Eleanor left Fairhaven with her recordings, her notes, and a renewed sense of purpose. The story of the Whispering House became the centerpiece of her first book, which brought her acclaim as a historian and storyteller. The mansion was eventually restored and turned into a museum dedicated to its dark past. Visitors claimed to hear faint whispers in the halls, but none were as clear or as insistent as the ones Eleanor had heard. The house, it seemed, was finally at peace, but Eleanor knew she would never forget the voices of the walls or the secrets they had shared, and she wondered if, somewhere in the world, another house might be waiting, its walls heavy with untold stories, whispering for someone brave enough to listen. The first time it happened, Ethan Daniels thought it was a coincidence. A sudden downpour had drenched him on an otherwise clear afternoon. No clouds had been in sight when he left his apartment, but within moments the skies had darkened, thunder rolled, and rain hammered down. Oddly, no one else around him got wet. People walked past with amused smiles or concerned glances while he stood soaked to the bone. Ethan laughed it off as bad luck, but it wasn't the last time. Soon the storms followed him everywhere. By the third storm, Ethan knew something was wrong. He had gone to visit his sister Claire in the suburbs, hoping to escape the unpredictable weather that seemed to plague him. But as soon as he arrived, the skies darkened. A sharp wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows of her house. Claire looked outside, frowning. "I thought they said it was going to be sunny all week." Ethan tried to laugh it off. "Guess I brought it with me." Her dog, Max, growled low in his throat, staring at Ethan. He hadn't stopped since Ethan entered the house. When Ethan left later that night, the storm followed him back to the city. It wasn't until a week later that Ethan finally heard the truth. He was walking through the park, thunder rumbling overhead, when an old woman approached him. She wore a tattered raincoat, her face lined with age and worry. "You can feel it, can't you?" she asked. Ethan stopped, startled. "Feel what?" "The storm. It's not natural." He stared at her, unsure if she was a wandering eccentric or someone who knew more than she let on. What do you mean? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You've been marked. The storm isn't just a storm, it's a hunter. It's coming for you. Ethan laughed nervously. Okay, sure. Thanks for the heads up. But as he turned to leave, the woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. You can't outrun it. The storm won't stop until it has what it wants. What does it want? He demanded, fear creeping into his voice. She shook her head. You'll have to figure that out yourself. But be warned, the longer you resist, the stronger it gets. The next storm was worse than any Ethan had experienced. Lightning struck dangerously close, illuminating his apartment in blinding flashes. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and doors. Desperate for answers, Ethan began to dig into his past. He scoured old photos, journals, and keepsakes, searching for anything that might explain why he was being targeted. That's when he found it, a letter from his late grandfather, buried in the bottom of a dusty box. The letter spoke of a family curse, passed down through generations. Ethan's great-grandfather, a farmer, had wronged someone, an old hermit who lived on the edge of town. The hermit had cursed their bloodline, vowing that a storm would one day claim them. Ethan had dismissed the story as a family myth when he first read it years ago. But now, with the storm outside raging, the words felt chillingly real. Ethan knew he couldn't face the storm alone. He reached out to Claire, explaining everything as best he could. I know it sounds insane, he said, pacing her living room, but I think this storm is part of a curse. It's hunting me. Claire frowned but didn't laugh. She had seen the storms that followed Ethan, the way they seemed to center around him. Okay, she said slowly. Let's say you're right. How do we stop it? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but there has to be a way. Maybe someone in town knows more about the curse. Together, they began to research the hermit mentioned in the letter. They found old records and newspaper clippings about a man named Elias Greaves, who had lived in isolation for most of his life. Elias had been accused of witchcraft and blamed for several misfortunes in the community before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Guided by the old records, Ethan and Claire tracked down the location of Elias's former cabin, deep in the woods outside town. The storm intensified as they approached, the wind whipping through the trees and rain slashing against their faces. The cabin was little more than a ruin, overgrown with moss and ivy. Inside, they found symbols carved into the walls, spirals, eyes, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. This is it, Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Suddenly, the air grew icy. The rain stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then a voice echoed through the cabin. You've come, it said, low and resonant. Ethan turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its form shifting like smoke. Why are you doing this? Ethan demanded. What do you want from me? The figure's eyes glowed faintly. Your bloodline wronged me. Now I take what I am owed. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't fight the storm, but maybe he could reason with it. What if I could make it right? He said. What if I could undo the harm my family caused? The shadowy figure tilted its head, considering. The harm cannot be undone, but perhaps a bargain can be made. What kind of bargain? Ethan asked warily. The figure extended a hand, its fingers wreathed in mist. Your freedom in exchange for another. Ethan's stomach turned. You want me to sacrifice someone else? Someone who carries no guilt, the figure said. An innocent life, freely given. That is the price. Ethan stared at the figure, his mind racing. Could he live with himself if he condemned someone else to save his own life? Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. Don't do it, Ethan. There has to be another way. But the storm was closing in, the air around them growing colder by the second. Ethan felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the inevitability of his fate. I can't, he said finally, his voice trembling. I won't trade someone else's life for mine. The figure's eyes narrowed. Then you will face the storm. As the figure vanished, the storm surged, a maelstrom of wind and ice. But as Ethan braced himself, he realized something had changed. The storm wasn't attacking him, it was retreating. The whispers faded, replaced by an uneasy calm. Slowly the skies cleared, revealing a pale dawn. Ethan and Claire stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. "It lets you go," Claire said finally. "Maybe refusing the bargain was the answer," Ethan replied. "Maybe the storm needed to see that I wouldn't pass the curse on to someone else." The storms never returned, but Ethan knew better than to believe he was entirely free. He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends, helping others in ways both big and small. And every time the wind howled or thunder rumbled in the distance, he felt a shiver of fear, wondering if the storm might one day return to collect its due. The villagers of Ashwood whispered of a bonfire that burned with cold flames. It was said to appear once every century in the middle of the forest during the longest night of winter. The flames, icy blue and ghostly white, neither warmed nor scorched. Instead, they chilled the soul of anyone who dared to approach. No one knew who or what created the bonfire, but stories passed down through generations claimed it was a gateway to the spirit world, a place where the living and the dead could meet. It was a beacon for restless souls and curious minds, but those who ventured too close often returned, changed if they returned at all. Rowan Cole had always been drawn to mysteries. An amateur folklorist, he spent his days exploring local legends and his nights poring over dusty tomes and faded maps. When he came across an old journal in Ashwood's crumbling library, he felt an electric thrill. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, who had written about witnessing the cold flames during the winter solstice of 1823. His descriptions were vivid, how the flames danced like spectral figures, how whispers filled the air, and how he saw his deceased wife standing within the fire. But what struck Rowan most was the final entry. "The flames grow colder, pulling me closer. She calls to me. I cannot resist. If I am to be lost, let my name be remembered." Rowan closed the journal with trembling hands. The date of the next solstice was only a week away. The night of the solstice arrived, bringing with it a bitter chill. Rowan packed a satchel with essentials: a flashlight, a notebook, a flask of hot tea, and a silver locket that had belonged to his late mother. He wasn't superstitious, but he felt compelled to bring something personal, just in case. The forest was eerily silent as he trudged through the snow. The trees, black and skeletal, seemed to lean closer with every step. Despite the cold, Rowan felt beads of sweat on his brow, his breath fogging in the freezing air. After what felt like hours, he saw it, a flicker of blue light in the distance. The flames. The bonfire was larger than he'd imagined, its icy flames licking the night sky. The light cast long, shifting shadows across the snow, and the air around it was frigid, stealing the warmth from his body. Rowan hesitated, fear knotting in his stomach, but his curiosity pushed him forward. As Rowan approached, he heard them, the whispers. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but as he drew closer, they grew louder, forming words that chilled him more than the air. "Rowan, come closer. Do you seek the truth?" He froze. How did the voices know his name? He looked around, but the forest was empty. The flames danced hypnotically, their cold glow reflecting off the snow. Rowan noticed something moving within the fire, shadows shifting and twisting. They began to take shape, forming figures. One figure stepped forward, her face pale and translucent. Rowan's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother. "Mom," he whispered. She smiled sadly, her eyes filled with longing. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice soft but firm. I had to, Rowan replied, stepping closer to the fire. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. Why are you here? How is this possible? This fire, it connects our worlds, she said. It draws the lost and the curious. But it's dangerous, Rowan. It feeds on those who linger too long. Rowan's mother reached out a hand, and he instinctively reached back. Her fingers were ice cold, and for a moment he felt a pull, like his very essence was being drawn into the flames. "Don't touch her!" a voice shouted. Rowan spun around to see an old man standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was weathered, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Rowan demanded. "My name is Silas," the man said. "I've been watching this fire for years, waiting for it to return. You can't trust what you see in there. It lies." Rowan glanced back at his mother, who looked at him with pleading eyes. "He's wrong," she said. "You can stay with me, Rowan. We can be together again." Silas stepped closer, shaking his head. "That's not your mother. It's the fire playing tricks. If you go in, you won't come back." Rowan felt torn, his mind spinning. Could he trust this stranger, or was the fire truly his chance to reunite with his mother? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the fire itself was alive. "Stay with us, Rowan," they chanted. "Join us. The living world holds nothing for you." Silas grabbed Rowan's arm, pulling him back. "Listen to me, boy. That fire takes your soul and leaves nothing behind. It doesn't matter who you see in there. They're gone. Let them go." Rowan looked at his mother, her expression filled with sorrow. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her form flickered, the image of her face twisting into something darker. "Don't listen to him," she hissed. "I'm your mother. Don't leave me." Rowan stumbled back, his heart pounding. The flames surged, reaching toward him as if alive. He could feel their pull, their icy grip on his soul. Silas dragged him away, shouting over the roar of the fire. "You have to let it go. The fire preys on your grief, your regrets. Don't let it take you." With all his strength, Rowan tore his gaze away from the flames. He let Silas lead him back into the forest, the whispers fading with each step. When they were far enough away, Rowan collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. What was that?" he asked. Silas knelt beside him, his expression grim. "The bonfire appears to those who carry pain in their hearts. It tempts them with what they've lost, but it's a trap. Once it has you, it never lets go." Rowan shivered, not from the cold, but from the memory of his mother's face. "Why does it exist?" "No one knows," Silas said. "Some say it's a remnant of an ancient curse. Others think it's a doorway to another world. But one thing is certain, it feeds on the living." Rowan left Ashwood the next day, vowing never to return. But the memory of the cold flames stayed with him, haunting his dreams. He couldn't forget the sight of his mother or the chilling whispers that had almost lured him to his doom. Silas had warned him that the fire would appear again, long after they were gone, to claim new victims. Rowan could only hope that others would resist its pull. As the years passed, Rowan found a measure of peace, but every winter solstice, he lit a small, warm fire in his hearth, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had almost lost. The bonfire of cold flames still burned somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next visitor. When Eleanor Whitmore received the letter from the estate lawyer, she didn't know what to expect. Her Aunt Agnes, a woman she barely knew, had passed away, leaving Eleanor her old Victorian house in the countryside. It wasn't a grand inheritance, more of a burden, Eleanor thought. The house was dilapidated, creaking under the weight of time, but it was hers now. Eager to sort through the place and decide its fate, Eleanor packed her bags and drove out to the sprawling, lonely property. As she walked through the dusty halls, memories of her few childhood visits trickled back. Aunt Agnes's stern face, the smell of lavender and mothballs, and the unsettling creaks and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The house felt heavy with history, but one room in particular drew her attention: the upstairs guest bedroom. It had a peculiar energy about it, one that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The closet in the corner was the focal point, a tall, ornate structure built into the wall, its dark wooden door engraved with intricate, swirling patterns. Eleanor avoided the closet during her initial cleaning, focusing instead on clearing out the rest of the house. Days passed, and each night as she lay in bed, the thought of the closet grew louder in her mind. It was as though it was calling her, demanding her attention. Finally, on the third day, she couldn't resist any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, Eleanor approached the closet. The air around it felt colder, and she hesitated before pulling the door open. Inside, there were no clothes or boxes, just an empty space lined with old, peeling wallpaper. But as her flashlight swept across the interior, Eleanor noticed something odd. The back of the closet wasn't solid. It shimmered faintly, like a heat mirage, and seemed to pulse gently, as though alive. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and the moment her hand touched the surface, she felt a rush of wind and a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was no longer in the guest bedroom. She stood in a lush garden bathed in soft golden light. The air smelled of blooming flowers, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees. It should have been beautiful, but something felt wrong. The garden was eerily silent, devoid of bird song or the hum of insects. In the distance, she could see a swing set, its ropes swaying despite the lack of wind. As Eleanor walked through the garden, she began to feel a strange familiarity. It wasn't until she approached the swing set that she realized why. This was her grandmother's garden, a place she hadn't visited since she was a child. She remembered swinging on that very swing, her grandmother pushing her gently. But her grandmother's house had been sold decades ago, and the garden had long since been replaced by a parking lot. How is this possible? Eleanor whispered. A faint laugh echoed behind her, and she spun around, her heart pounding. There was no one there. Eleanor explored further, her unease growing with every step. The garden began to change, shifting from her grandmother's backyard to other familiar places from her childhood. A park she used to visit, her old elementary school playground, even the narrow alleyway where she'd once scraped her knee. The transitions were seamless, yet disorienting, as though the spaces were stitched together by invisible threads. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but as Eleanor approached, she recognized it. It was her, a younger version of herself, no older than 7. The child version of Eleanor stood still, clutching a stuffed rabbit she'd lost decades ago. "Why are you here?" the child asked, her voice soft but accusatory. I don't know," Eleanor stammered. "You shouldn't be here," the child said, and then she vanished. Eleanor's journey through the strange, shifting world of the closet grew darker. The once bright landscapes became shadowed, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. She began to see more figures, people from her past, their faces half hidden in shadow. Her father, who had left when she was 10, appeared on a distant hill, his back turned to her. Her childhood best friend, whom she'd lost touch with after a bitter fight, sat by a riverbank, skipping stones. Each time Eleanor tried to approach them, they would vanish. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't voices she recognized, but they spoke of things she'd forgotten, or perhaps tried to forget. "You broke her heart," one voice said. "You should have said goodbye," another whispered. "You can't escape the past," they chanted together. Eventually, Eleanor found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat jars filled with swirling, luminescent mist. As she approached, she saw that each jar was labeled with a name and a date. She picked one up and gasped. Her own name was etched into the glass, along with the date of her 10th birthday. Curious, she opened the jar, and the mist poured out, enveloping her. She was no longer in the room. Instead, she stood in her childhood home, watching herself blow out the candles on her birthday cake. She remembered that day vividly. Her father had promised to take her to the zoo, but he'd never shown up. As the memory played out, Eleanor felt the pain of that broken promise all over again. When the mist dissipated, she was back in the room, tears streaming down her face. Each jar held a memory, and as Eleanor opened more of them, she was forced to relive moments she had buried deep. Her first heartbreak, the death of her childhood pet, the time she'd lied to her mother and gotten caught. Eleanor realized the closet wasn't just a gateway to forgotten memories. It was a prison for them, a place where the past was stored and preserved, no matter how painful. The whispers grew louder, pleading with her to stay. "You can't leave," they said. "You belong here now." But Eleanor refused to be trapped. She gathered her courage and ran, the jars shattering around her as she moved. The memories swirled in chaos, but she kept going, focusing on the faint shimmer of light in the distance. She burst through the closet door and fell to the floor of the guest bedroom, gasping for air. Eleanor boarded up the closet that night, determined never to open it again. But something had changed within her. The memories she had relived wouldn't fade, and she found herself reflecting on the choices she'd made in the relationships she'd neglected. The closet had forced her to confront her past, but it had also given her a chance to heal. Months later, when she finally sold the house, she left the closet untouched, warning the new owners never to open it. But deep down, she knew the closet would call to someone else someday. After all, the past never stays buried for long. In the heart of Pine Hollow Forest, there was a trail known as Whispering Loop. Locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones of those who had ventured onto the path and never returned. Stories passed through generations warned of hikers who would wander the trail only to find themselves walking in circles, unable to leave no matter how far they went. Some claimed it was a trick of nature, a confusing maze of identical trees. Others believed it was cursed, a pocket of reality where time and space fractured. Despite the warnings, thrill seekers occasionally tried their luck, confident they could break the loop. None ever did. Emma Waverly was not one to believe in legends. A seasoned hiker and nature photographer, she had explored trails across the country. Pine Hollow was just another forest to conquer, another place to capture the beauty of untouched nature. She arrived early one morning, her gear packed and her camera ready. The air was crisp, and the forest was eerily quiet. A single wooden sign marked the entrance to Whispering Loop. "Easy hike," she muttered, brushing off the uneasy feeling that crept over her. The trail was well-trodden, lined with towering pines that stretched endlessly into the sky. The ground was soft with moss, and the occasional bird call broke the silence. Emma marveled at how untouched the area seemed. But after an hour of walking, she noticed something strange. The trees looked familiar, too familiar. A distinctive twisted pine with a lightning-scarred trunk caught her eye. She had passed it before. She checked her map and compass, frowning. Both seemed accurate, yet she couldn't shake the feeling she was retracing her steps. Determined not to let paranoia get the best of her, Emma pressed on. She set small markers along the trail, stones piled into cairns, broken twigs. But an hour later, she saw her own markers ahead of her. Her stomach sank. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. "I must have doubled back somehow." She tried a different tactic, stepping off the trail to forge her own path. The underbrush was thick and the forest seemed darker off the beaten path. but Emma was confident she could find her way out. Yet no matter how far she wandered, she always ended up back on the trail, standing before the same twisted pine. The sun was still high, but the light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer. Emma decided to turn back the way she came, but after walking for another hour, she was horrified to find herself back at the starting point. The sign marking Whispering Loop stood mockingly in front of her. Panic began to set in. Emma pulled out her phone, only to find there was no signal. She checked her GPS, but it refused to load. "Okay, stay calm," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just a trail. I can figure this out." As she sat down to rest, she heard it, a faint whispering, like wind brushing through the trees. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, fragmented voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Emma spun around, but there was no one there. Her heartbeat quickened. She packed up and started walking again, faster this time. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Hours passed, though the position of the sun didn't seem to change. Emma's legs ached and her water supply was running low. She began to notice other strange things. Shadows moving in the corner of her vision, figures standing just beyond the trees that vanished when she looked directly at them. The forest felt alive, watching her, toying with her. Her thoughts grew disjointed. She couldn't remember how long she had been on the trail. Days? Hours? It was all blending together. "Someone has to know I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone will come looking for me." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The world outside the forest felt distant, unreal. As night fell, Emma realized she had no choice but to stop and set up camp. The darkness was oppressive, the trees pressing closer than they had during the day. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with laughter, childlike and cruel. Emma tried to block it out, huddling in her sleeping bag with her flashlight clutched in her hands. At some point, she fell into a restless sleep, only to awaken to the sound of footsteps circling her tent. "Who's there?" she shouted, unzipping the tent and shining her light into the darkness. The beam illuminated a figure standing just beyond the trees, a pale, emaciated figure with hollow eyes that stared right through her. Emma screamed and bolted, abandoning her gear as she ran blindly into the forest. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the trail. Gasping for breath, she looked up to see the twisted pine looming above her. It was then she realized the truth. She wasn't alone. The forest was full of others, lost souls trapped in the loop. In the dim light, she saw them emerge from the shadows. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes tattered. Some looked like they had been there for decades. One of them, a man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, crouched beside her. "There's no way out," he said softly. "Not unless the forest lets you go." "What does it want?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. "It doesn't want anything. It just is." Days or perhaps weeks passed. Emma stopped trying to escape. The forest was her world now. The whispers became her companions, the shadowy figures her only company. She began to change. Her thoughts grew slower, her memories of the outside world fading like a distant dream. The forest was all she knew, all she cared about. One day, as she wandered the trail, she noticed a young man standing at the entrance to Whispering Loop. He looked eager, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Another one," Emma murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She watched as he stepped onto the trail, oblivious to the fate that awaited him. And the loop continued. The legend of Whispering Loop remains. Hikers occasionally disappear into Pine Hollow, their stories adding to the growing mystery. The locals no longer speak of it, but they know the truth. The forest doesn't just trap people, it absorbs them, making them part of its endless cycle. And for those who wander its cursed trail, there is no escape, only the eternal loop.